Big barber shows up, yeah.
Ooh, is that its starting recording noise? That's super
Three
pleasant.
times. I'm not sure
Oh.
what microphone feedback got going on there.
Okay, it's being
I-
recorded. Sounds good.
Yep. I have a note on my screen says it's being recorded, so must be.
Great. That sounds great. And then I'll start sharing my screen then with,
Ryan's on.
yeah, Ryan's on as well. Okay, let's try this. Okay. And now we should be able to see, Steve, we can see you up on the big screen and we can see the agenda.
I'm sorry you have to see my ugly face on the screen. Good heavens.
Reflecting off the top of your head.
Hey, on this technology, you can see we also have another little camera up here. And Tony can move that around as people speak here, so we can use of Steve can see you as well. Okay. Yes.
Probably look like.
It was up there. That's it. I think it's gonna work.
Call the meeting to order. And just because my voice is so bad, I'm going to very quickly turn it over to somebody else. So we've got the agenda in front of us. Hopefully you guys have all had a chance to take a look at it. I think we're going to want to spend the majority of our time listening to the Seaport information. So unless we've got something else that we want to add at this point to the agenda, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So when you look through the agenda, you can see there that this meeting is the big reveal of our seeker stock assessments for the Bay Clams that we've been talking about for a long time. So we've devoted the majority of the meeting to that. And the way that rolls through is Tony Andrea is going to give us the new stock assessments for Bay Clams in the intertidal zone, Tillamook Bay. And that should take roughly half an hour or so, 20 minutes, and then 10 minutes or so for questions. Then we'll shift that over to Summer and Mitch to talk about how do we move from those stock assessments, the field data, into coming up with our quota, with our fisheries management number in terms of setting that. And we'll talk about that for a bit. And then we'll shift back over to Tony, and Tony will finish off with another presentation talking with us about the remainder of the field work for this year. The team's up here working now, so they'll describe that. And the new scuba surveys that are going to also take place here between now and end of June. So we'll talk about that too. And then we'll wrap that up, and then we'll pass over to subcommittee. Are you Larry, subcommittee chair?
Yeah, everyone.
Everybody, yeah.
Yeah.
And there, just open that discussion up to the work from the subcommittee on transferability of dive permits, and then finish off with the next steps for everybody. I think that's a pretty full agenda for 2 hours.
Yep.
That's what we're doing. All right. So with that, then I think, are we ready to go? Technology ready to go?
I think
I believe so.
Okay.
Tony,
Well,
I'm gonna move so they can see you presenting and not me.
what is that?
I don't know.
I think it's coming from Steve Williams.
We got noise.
Like a pen clicking or something?
Oh, it's probably me clicking this thing.
Yeah, we definitely hear that.
I'll stop that.
Okay.
I have a tendency to do that when I got one of those kind of pens.
Don't be nervous.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to be able to present the data from last year's field season on the intertidal areas that we surveyed. And so just kind of a reminder of kind of the overview of the sample plan is that we did many of the intertidal areas of the northern portion of the bay last year. So these are the ones on this slide that are in purple. And then we're working for the rest of the intertidal and subtidal is on the docket for this year. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. It's just the kind of set for that. And so the initial focus on these northern tide flats, this is where a majority of cockle and gaper clam populations were found in the previous survey in 2010 to 2012. It's also where most of the sport and commercial effort is focused. And so that was part of the reason why there was a focus on the northern portion of the bay. And then as far as the types of samples, just kind of a quick reminder of the types of samples that Seeker collects is we have some of the samples which are habitat only. And so these are areas that the field teams go out with quadrats and measure 30 or so habitat variables to give an idea of what the habitat is throughout the estuary. And you can see from these maps here, so all these black points represent sites where we collected habitat data. So we did, almost a little over 550 sites last year. And to just give some context is what the team was able to do last year was the total number of those same type of habitat sites that were done over 2 years in the previous survey in 2010 and 2011. And so on these larger tide flats, these are 100 by 100 meter grids throughout the tide flat. And then on smaller tide flats, such as that around Garibaldi and the rock pile in the north portion of the bay, that's a 30 by 30 meter bed. So very tightly packed because of the small area of that particular tide flat. And then the second type of samples that we collect are our detailed assessment method ones. And so these include collecting that same habitat data for those grid sites, but also extracting the shellfish and measuring all of the shellfish that we collect at those sites. And so these sites, again, are randomized sites. And so they're essentially scaled to the area of a given tide flat, as well as the area of given intertidal tide heights to be able to track, what portions of the tide flat where different players are found. And so we use 2 different types of extractive methods. On the left here shows the crew doing our mega coring one, where we have a boat-based essentially trash pump that's used to create a suction that allows us to essentially sample half meter squared area down to about 2 feet into the sediment. And then there's a mesh bag that collects all the clams and other shellfish in that, which we then sample and measure. And then on some tide flats, particularly the western portion of the Garibaldi flat here, which has a lot of gravel and cobble, we can't really use the mega coring method in order to sample the clams. And so we do have to do manually digging in those locations. So this photo on the right-hand side shows the crew working on that. And so that's a meter squared area down to the same depth that we would sample for the mega core samples. And so essentially any clam that's greater than 8 millimeters is then collected in those samples, and all the shellfish are measured. And so,
Tony, before you go on, can you point out why there's no sampling in the little hook there in the middle of the bay?
that has been off of both surveys because this is a seal haul out area, so we have to maintain a 500-foot buffer away from there, and so there's really no time that we could ever sample in that areas, and even some of these areas here are also haul out areas, but the team was just pretty strategic in essentially finding the days and times where the seals weren't actually present in that location. And we're having some of the same issues here on the fog flat this year for being able to do that.
Seals all moved back there. I don't think they're staying on that farm anymore.
Yeah. Yes.
That's the killer whales one there yesterday.
Really?
Really?
They were there Monday,
It's somebody said,
Monday.
well, it sent me a video of them.
How far up bay?
They look like they're in a ghost hole.
They were
Oh,
right
interesting.
outside of the TEP office windows.
Yeah, we saw them off the boathouse.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
You think they go past?
One of the days I'm not on the bay.
Yes.
Everything else.
And so any shellfish that we capture in those, we have a number of different kind of biological metrics that we collect. So, the density of the clams and other shellfish at that location, length, width, and weight for the clams in order to generate the kind of biomass estimates and size distributions that we use kind of in the management side of that. And these are just examples of us collecting and measuring particular samples during the survey. And might have noticed for a little, I just had to nostalgically put in Liz, even though
Yeah.
it's normally with WFW. You guys was Seeker for a long time. So as I'm talking about the data from these surveys, I kind of have it broken down into kind of 3 portions. So I'm going to start out by going across the different tide flats and give an idea of, on the different tide flats, what would you expect as far as the species of bay clams that would be found in that location. And then the majority of the data that I'll talk about will go species by species and talk about the spatial distribution of the species, the biomass that we found in our 2022 survey, comparisons to what we found in the previous survey. So are there any changes? Do we see increases or decreases in different species? And do we have that occurring on all tide flats, or one tide flat or another? And then for a couple of the species, I'll talk a little bit about some of the habitat specific relationships that we found for some of the clam species. And then I'll finish up by then talking about how we then generate these tide flat biomass estimates, and then showing you a table, which you also have in your handout, which are all of the biomass estimates for all the species on all the tide flats that we sampled last year. So in order to kind of read this chart, so essentially these are all essentially pie charts of relative biomass of the different species. And so the different species are coded by the different colors. So cockles are in orange, gaper clams in this pink purple, butter clams yellow, and native littleneck in this light blue. And so, for example, this particular site here on the eastern side of the Crabbing Pier, you see this particular site here, which is all orange. So that means 100% of the clams that we found at that location were cockles. And so you can look at that and see just from the color patterns what different types of clams were found throughout the study area. And so a good way to think about the Garibaldi Flat is kind of this eastern section, which is more soft sediment tide flat like, and then this western region, which has a lot more cobble and gravel habitat, and obviously this area here, which is one of the major targets of the sport clam fishery in this region. And so the primary types of clams that you would find in the Garibaldi area are the butter clams, and so those are strongly associated with cobble gravel areas, and I'll show you some support for that in the data. We also see some gapers, and there's some light blue here, so this is actually one of the only locations where we also found the native littleneck clams.
Where's
Within the bay.
Where was the butter? The native?
Just a couple of 3 of those.
Yeah, so see these little blue
Pac-Man.
slices. So there's a proportion of the total biomass, yep, which is comprised of native littlenecks there. And then as we get out to more of the soft sediment portions, then it tends to kind of transition to a mostly cockle clam population, albeit limited, because if anyone who has been out here know that this is an extensive burrowing shrimp bed out here. So a lot of those, these black dots represent samples that were collected, but there were no clams in those samples. And so that's the story for the clam composition in Garibaldi Flat. And then if we look at the other 2 tide flats, most of the clams that we find on Middle Flat and Bay Ocean North are essentially going to be cockles and gaper clams. And so for Middle Flat, it's primarily cockles, particularly throughout kind of the central and edges of Middle Flat, as well as some gaper clams along the eelgrass bed along the outer edge. For Bay Ocean North, essentially this outer edge here, which has this extensive eelgrass bed, is where you find the majority of the gapers on Bay Ocean North. And then as you go up into kind of like these higher portions of the tide flat, then you start to see a bit more of the cockle populations there. But as I'll show you that even though you see cockles in both Bay Ocean North and Middle Flat, when you actually look at the biomass of cockles, which we will momentarily, you'll see that there's a greater density and biomass of cockles on Middle Flat relative to Bay Ocean. And so now I'll talk about each of the individual species.
Tony, can
start-
I ask you a question?
Certainly.
Back to your distribution map there that you showed.
Yes.
I don't know if you have a way to do this, but that Middle Flat sampling how does that distribution compare to what it used to be? One of the things I seem to remember, more gapers on that flat in past years than I might run into now. That's just my unscientific. Does the distribution of the sampling, which is random, so it may not work, but has it changed some out there on that Middle Flat, or is that something you're going to talk to us about in a few minutes?
I'm going to talk about it for both gapers and cockles.
Okay.
But the density of sampling between the 2010, which is really when we last sampled Middle Flat, and
Right.
2022, the actual number of random sites that we visited was essentially identical between the two surveys.
Okay. I'll wait for the information. Thank you.
No problem, Steve. And in fact, here's one of those pieces of information. So this first slide here shows all three of those tide flats: Garibaldi, Middle Flat, and Bay Ocean North. And then what you see here are essentially these polygons. In this case, so the colored polygons here represent what the population distribution of cockles were in our 2010 survey of these tide flats. In a way to look at, we can then overlay what we found in 2022 to see whether or not the distribution of those populations were in the same locations or in different parts of those tide flats. And so if we overlay what we found in 2022, the biggest take home is, yeah, they're found in some of those same areas, particularly on Garibaldi Flat. But if you look at these larger tide flats, you see a much broader spatial distribution of cockles in both of these tide flats relative to 2010. And it's most obvious in Middle Flat, which were really only found along these outer edges or around eelgrass beds in 2010. And they're pretty much found everywhere throughout Middle Flat in our most recent survey. And so if we actually look at the biomass and compare biomass among the three tide flats, most of the highest biomass was found on Middle Flat relative to Bay Ocean North and Garibaldi. And indeed, even though you see a lot of locations with cockles, and as you saw in the previous one with the composition one, you see lots of sites where there are cockles. They obviously are not very large cockles, because even with those large numbers, Bay Ocean North has the lowest biomass of cockles among the three areas, even considering the smaller size of Garibaldi. And then obviously we can then look at what the biomass was in 2010 relative to 2022 to look at any shifts in where we found cockle populations. And so here the white bars represent the mean biomass in 2010, and then the orange bars represent what we found in 2022. And so you can see that in both Garibaldi and Bay Ocean North, we had pretty comparable biomass in 2022 is what we found in the previous survey. But there was like a 50% difference, 50% increase in cockle biomass found on Middle Flat.
Tony, can you remind me, maybe I missed it, but did you describe what the error bars already?
Those I have not, but I would, but thanks for pointing that out. So these error bars are the 95% confidence intervals. So the low and the high estimate. And so we are 95% confident that the true value for biomass is between those upper and lower extremes on that.
This has to do with the number of clams, so the density of clams doesn't necessarily have to do with the weight or the size or anything else like that.
No, this figure on the left is number of clams, but the actual data figure there is biomass, since that's really
That is
what we talk about when we're managing the clams is going to be the overall stock estimate.
Thank you.
And so we can have the same kind of series of figures for all of the other clams. And so here was the gaper population distribution found in 2010. And so in the previous survey, essentially it was essentially the rock pile here on Garibaldi Flat and a very extensive gaper bed that had occurred on Bay Ocean North on the previous survey. If we then overlay what we found this year, essentially, we still have gapers commonly found within the Garibaldi Flat, again in the rock pile. However, in some of the areas where there were much more extensive gaper populations, that there is still a fairly large gaper population here on Bay Ocean North, but it seems to be a little bit smaller than what we found 10 years ago, and that the gapers are much more patchy on Middle Flat during our most recent survey, and essentially were almost always found associated with these eelgrass beds along the outer edge of the tide flat.
Overall, though, across the flats, there's been an increase in area the gapers are growing, though.
Yeah.
That's what I've noticed.
But part of that is like, I don't have that here, is part of that is that like, so in this section here, part of the reason that we see a little bit more of the extension going over here is that there's a lot of eelgrass now present in this area. The eelgrass bed has expanded, and it wasn't in this area during the previous survey.
The island second behind Middle Flat. Did you guys do the survey in 2010 on island?
On this island? No, we just did the habitat grid. They're out. That's the beginning of this field season, is actually doing the shellfish surveys out there.
Because there wasn't like any plans on that island in like 2010.
Yeah.
And now there's a.
Yeah, we found that there was just a handful of clams there
Yeah.
previously.
Yeah, now it's kind of cool.
And then if we look at gaper clam biomass, that the highest amount, the greatest biomass was found on Garibaldi and Bay Ocean North. And although they're also found in Middle Flat, there's very high variability, obviously, since there are only a few sites where we had gapers found on Middle Flat. And if we look at the shift in biomass, the biggest changes that we see is essentially here on Bay Ocean North, where we saw almost a 50% decline in overall biomass of gapers in our most recent survey relative to what we found in 2010. And although we saw some of this increase in Garibaldi, you really can't tell the difference between the two surveys for the overall biomass in both Garibaldi and Middle Flat. And so they seem to have stayed the same. And then the big difference is a drop in the overall biomass of gapers found on Bay Ocean North. And then I had hinted that you can have that gapers have this strong association with eelgrass. And so every one of these locations here on the map on the left that has a large blue circle is a site where eelgrass also co-occurred with a sample that was collected for clams. And you can see almost all of the purple circles, which would be the density of gapers, occurred within sites that had eelgrass. So there seems to be this strong association of gaper populations with the eelgrass beds, at least on this tide flat. And that shows up in, if you do a comparison of on Bay Ocean North of the mean biomass of gapers in eelgrass versus unvegetated areas. And it's a pretty huge difference in what you would expect to find for gaper clams on this tide flat.
Is that similar for other locations? Or is it just for that particular?
It's pretty much for this tide flat. If you do when we did the same analysis on middle flat, you couldn't really distinguish. There was really no differences, no significant differences between the two habitats. And then for Garibaldi flat, there's a much more stronger association of gaper clams with the cobble gravel areas on the western portion of the flat, relative then to eelgrass. They're really only a much smaller eelgrass bed found in the Garibaldi flat area.
The middle flat island, which like Steven said, gapers didn't seem to be as thick there. They're not what they used to be in the eelgrass states, either how old or picked out over the years. That's something I've noticed out there as well. But maybe why you're not finding them out there, Steve, because they kind of redistributed or something.
And then when we're talking about butter clams and native littlenecks, I mentioned that pretty much almost all of their populations are only found on Garibaldi flat. So instead of showing the whole bay for shifts through time, I'm just going to look at the Garibaldi flat populations for butter clams. And so you can see that the butter clam population in 2010 was primarily out here in the rock pile and along this kind of cobbly bedrock area here along this outer beach. And then that's also where we found butter clams this last survey. And so that's pretty much where the whole butter clam population was associated. So very comparable distribution as we saw in 2010. However, there was a big difference in biomass. And so obviously, since there are very few butter clams on Middle Flat and Bay Ocean North, it's not surprising that most of the at least intertidal butter clams are associated here in Garibaldi. But that if you look at the difference between 2010 and 2022, you can also see a dramatic increase in biomass of butter clams found on Garibaldi tide flat. And this was not too surprising to me, having been in a number of estuaries over the past few years. There's been some pretty huge recruitment of butter clams kind of coast-wide. And in fact, if you were to go over to, for example, to the south to Netarts Bay, you know, that main clamming flat, which used to have a very large gaper population, you trip over butter clam shows everywhere now. And actually, when I did the clamming clinics last year, that was primarily what I was showing a lot of the participants of how to dig, because the gapers were just not as common as they had been previously. But definitely there was a very large recent recruitment of butter clams, since most of the butter clams are, you know, pretty small, a couple years old. And then again, if you think of from a habitat perspective, all of these red circles represent sites where the substrate was primarily cobble and gravel, whereas the yellow circles represent essentially sand silt, so normal kind of tide flat sediments. And almost all of the butter clam population was associated with cobble gravel habitat. And if you were to then look at the mean biomass for butter clams and the cobble gravel relative to the sand silt, again, you have this huge difference where you almost have 1.5 kilograms of butter clam biomass per square meter in the cobble gravel habitat relative to some of these softer sediments found throughout the estuary. So it definitely has a strong association with that type of habitat, both intertidally and subtidally as well. And then for native little neck clams in our previous survey in 2010, they were only found on Garibaldi. We did find some native little necks on some of the other tide flats last year, but still the majority of the population was found on Garibaldi. And again, it was primarily associated with the rock pile and the beach out here. That's that large recreational area. With that, however, you can see if we were to go back to butters, you can see that when we talk about the densities, we're getting to over 50 clams per square meter with things like butter clams out on Garibaldi Flat. Those are not the types of densities we're finding for native little neck, where super dense native little neck area is greater than 3 clams per square meter. And then that comes across when you look at the overall mean biomass. So instead of hundreds to thousands of grams per square meter, we're talking 20 grams per square meter. So it's a fairly small population that's persisting out there. And that if we look at the shift between 2010 and 2022, that population seems to have decreased in that time frame. Obviously, there's still a lot of variability there, so it's hard to say that those are truly different, but that is somewhat worrisome, but not unexpected, since native little neck clam populations across the Pacific Northwest, not just in Oregon, but in Washington, DC, Alaska, have been showing kind of a decadal scale decline over time. We don't really know what are the underlying causes for that decline. But it is, worrisome that we're continuing to see either a leveling or a decline. It'd be interesting to see in a few years when we're back out in Netarts, because Netarts was actually one of the few estuaries that we have surveyed in Oregon that has a very extensive native little neck population. And in fact, we're, essentially was, butters and native little necks when we did that the 2-year survey at Netarts Bay were very spatially extensive throughout the bay and had the largest populations of the clams in that bay. And so kind of just a quick summary from these results. Cockles showed an increase in biomass since 2010 with the notable change on middle flat, and that they were found across all the different habitat types. So they weren't necessarily strongly associated with just one or the other. And that's not unexpected. So cockles are much more cosmopolitan. It's like they're found in open sand habitats, they're found in cobble habitats, they're found in shelly areas, and they're found in eelgrass beds as well. Relative to a couple of the other species here, which seem to have a much more stronger association with a different habitat type. So for gaper clams, there was a decrease in overall biomass, but this was driven primarily by Bay Ocean North, where the largest kind of biomass was found in 2010. And that the populations in both 2010 and 2022 are strongly associated with the eelgrass beds found on that tide flat. Butter clams are found in gravelly areas of Garibaldi Flat, and that there's been a large increase in populations since 2010. And then for native little necks, they were found in gravelly areas of Garibaldi Flat with low populations in both 2010 and 2022. And so that's an overall picture of what we saw in the clam populations, at least in those northern tide flats. And so the next step was to generate a stock estimate. And so essentially taking some of these data that I was showing you, which are things like biomass per square meter here, and then using our understanding of the area of the areas that we sampled, and by multiplying it out by the area, then we would have this stock estimate, which would be the total pounds of that clam per each of those intertidal regions. And so that's where this, and so this, I'm sure, will be a point of discussion and obviously these we generated each year as we're getting more data for both the rest of the intertidal and the subtidal. But essentially what this table has is for the 4 species, our estimate of biomass for each of the 3 tide flats for Garibaldi, Middle Flat, and Bay Ocean North. And then here, the biomass here denoted by the asterisk is actually the lower 95% confidence interval, so the most conservative estimate of the population, which is typically what we use for management purposes, for the different species and across the flats. And so, for example, you can see that Middle Flat has the greatest overall stock estimate for cockles, although there's still a significant amount of cockles found in the ocean.
Question from Steve Williams here.
Okay, Steve?
Just one question back, Tony. You're probably going to answer it coming up, but there's no, do we do any age distribution work on these things? Is there anything associated with changes in age or anything like that that you guys have been sampling? Or is that, I suppose that's something you're going to tell me about in a minute.
We do not have good age estimates for clams.
Okay.
For any of the clams.
Size estimates.
Yeah, we have size estimates, so we could have size distributions, which would give you, a proxy for age, but not actual age.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
No problem. And then for gaper clams, not surprisingly, based on what I was saying, was that the majority of the stock biomass is found on Bay Ocean North relative to the other tide flats for gapers. That most of the butters are found in Garibaldi, and then the native little necks are also found in Garibaldi, but that's not a number that we would be proud of as far as a population that can support extensive effort and harvest. That's where, so these are the numbers, then I would then pass on to Summer and Mitch to then use for the management side.
Yeah, so let's take a break and ask Tony any other questions and then from there then we'll switch over. So Steve, let me answer real quick. Tony provided the correct short answer that we don't have ages for these specific individuals or biomass. It would be great to have that. I wish we did have that.
Right.
Early on, a good decade, almost a decade and a half ago, we were investigating that and started to go through it. I remember even, Tony, didn't you have a get trained in New Jersey trip to go learn how to age clams at Rutgers University or something? It was yeah. So we were heading down that path. It would be a nice addition for us at some point, but we just don't have that information here.
Yeah, and we did do, at least in the early 2010s, we did attempt to do an experiment that would go over 4 or 5 years to look at kind of age and growth. And we were trying to use that in Uquinna Bay, but unfortunately we hit a couple bad winters, and essentially all of the clams were killed by freshets during winter storms. Before we even were able to collect a single data point on that study. But I know that our shellfish biologist on the South Coast, Scott Groth, has been able to do some measurements of cockle growth in South Slough in Coos Bay fairly effectively. But he was able to use areas that were not extensively accessible or utilized by sport clammers.
And return to those, every year. So different time series, which really helps when you're trying to track kind of that size frequency through time and get age out of that.
And many people will just count the rings and call that age, and that's not horrible, but it's not so good that it's super accurate enough to tell this year class versus another year class. So ODFW used to collect tons of data on that, but we've kind of gotten away from that. Because if it's, this clam is 5 years old, give or take 3 years, It doesn't
Yeah.
really.
And in truth, to get the number of clams, so we did have, it was kind of like late eighties, early nineties, but it was more of a citizen science project because we needed the number of people to essentially intercept and talk to climbers in order to have the willingness for that to be done. And they did that for a number of years, including in Tillamook Bay. And so we do have that data, and they were, as Mitch said, kind of like the external growth rings, which are not ideal, but they do give you at least a good estimate of the age.
Weather season. More than-
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
So, flat biomass, you know, as opposed to the Bay Ocean North biomass and the Garibaldi biomass, say on the cockles. You know, we know that there was 180,000 pounds of clams taken off the middle biomass a couple of years ago. And then again, a big quota last year, and then they've been working on the quota again this year. That's kind of a conveyor belt biomass that can change, you know, depending on the types of swells and what we have as far as pushing stuff in, you know, and up. Whereas like the Bay Ocean biomass flat, it's not as fast as changing type of conveyor system. Whereas we could take the 115,000 pounds off of the middle flat and there'll be 115,000 pounds on there again next season. But whereas if we were to go to the Bay Ocean biomass, even though I was out there the other day and there was way more clams than I've ever seen on there before. You know, in the same spots I've harvested completely out before, that, you know, there is kind of no sterilization of the zone out there. Say a climber comes in and literally sterilizes the zone of a cockles, for instance. They can go back there the next week or two and there'll be clams there again. So somehow that's gotta be kind of conveyed in that. I wouldn't say the same thing about gapers and butters, you know, it's a little bit about butters because they move, not positive of that, especially out in sandy zones. But with the gapers only when they're little.
yeah. Once they're past juveniles, gapers can't really.
Yeah, once they're this big, they don't want to rebury themselves. It's easy because they've got fat, you know, as opposed to it's like a little knife blade when they're younger. But that middle biomass flat number is going to be an ever changing number, you know, both from harvesting from just how many clams are rolling across that, and even on that island behind it, it used to not be there. And that goes back to them working on the jetty again and pushing more water in the bay than it used to. You know, the areas out where we sterilized the cockles out last year out, you know, by the jetties, they were the best they were ever this year. More of them, and, you know, they've been like they've never been taken before. That was, I contributed that to the giant swells we had. We were finding mussel shells this big clear up, you know, almost on middle flat, that weren't, you know, this washed in this winter. You know, those are giant jetty, you know, mussels, and they're still alive. And, so that's stuff that, and then that whole area's been Shane, you haven't built out there, but you were working out there with Steve in those same areas, and those areas just kind of, it's all, I swear they all roll in the winter time when you have those giant storms and swells up through the channel there and just kind of reseeded, just like those big mussel shells were laying in there. And those mussel shells were, one of them was buried just with the tip sticking out, and it was still alive, you know, but the other one was slightly buried, was dead, and freshly dead, still stunk. And so those are moved all the way from the jetty through Kensal Point, all the way almost to the middle flat, you know, this year, with all the cockles that moved with them. And so that was a first for me to see mussels that far in there, that big in the jetties. And we
Yeah,
did
you
have-
can see them like under docks as
Yeah,
opposed
well,
to.
we have those huge swells this year, and that's probably where she pushed that in. That's still the storm that came in, because it hits that port jetty sticking out a little bit farther, all that current hits it, pushes it in, we're getting a lot more flow from that. And I'm below the red when I put the south jetty in, but it's gonna change that to some degree, it's gonna have to be like a direct west flow and have all that clean water coming today. So as much as I wanna see the jetties fixed for the boats and stuff, at the same time, I want to see the jetty.
Pros and cons, everything.
It'll just make the bay more stagnant. I think.
Tony, when was the start date of the sector and the end date?
For when the sampling occurred. It was like around this time of year, so like mid to late April was the start. And then the completion was beginning of September.
Yeah, we probably had most of it wrapped up by mid to late August, but we're going back for, 2 to 3 sites into September.
And then middle flat was being primarily sampled earlier in the summer, so was probably completed by like June or early July. With Bay Ocean North being the flat that we kind of ended the last kind of like August, September timeframe.
When you guys are out there and you got a day like this in April and a day in August, you see the difference weather-wise, plant population. Does yours show that on a day, say like it hailed and rained, you go to a site and there's not much, whatever your little squares are compared to a nice hot sunny day?
The major difference that you would see would be more some of the other habitat type data that we would collect. So like things like for example, eelgrass would be peaking in like late June, July, and so that would be most extensive during that time frame.
Okay.
Relative to kind of early in the season where the eelgrass might not have started to really grow yet for the growing season.
But as far as
Well,
plant
the
numbers
plants.
in that quadrat or in that core,
Yeah.
they go down, they excavate every sand
Yeah.
Okay.
grain of sand.
So it doesn't matter whether we can see it or anything like that. It's essentially like a vacuum. Yeah, it's just like whatever's there. It's just a big vacuum.
You guys
To
do
the
your
depth.
environment survey of each spot. Are you doing just a surface survey, what's there, sand or mud, or are you going down 2 feet and saying, well, there's this layer of sand, turns to mud, then turns to tilma and charcoal, because there's a huge difference in the habitat of just a couple inches in places out there to where that changes from time to time, or what we stand one time in kind of tacky mud, and other time not big changes out there, but you know what I mean? And those areas where the black is only slightly below any of
Yeah.
those layers, you're gonna have a lot of copper, promotion, there, they'll be moving in, you like that.
Yeah, no, it's really the top like 10 to 15 centimeters is where those types of samples for like sediment type and substrate.
So that wouldn't account for like a gaper, what's down, a foot down, those can't necessarily compute the environmental area to what that gaper is, a foot down, you're not.
Taking that sample. Right?
Yeah, we do get data on, so like where that black portion starts, so the anoxic layer, we do that, but we don't do it to the depth, that a deep gaper would be. But we can see some, if it's right under the surface or if it's, deeper than our survey, we can tell that. Which is about.
Some areas are like filling with mud, and there's sanding in.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes that happens really fast and sometimes it gets scoured away and sometimes it gets buried. If the gaper clam is lucky, he or she is there that whole time through that growing and digging. And a lot of this stuff is happening on top of it, and or it's digging down through those layers. So, yeah, it'd be interesting to know all that, but that's a whole nother team.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But should we move
Yeah.
on forward?
All right, so let's now at this point then say thanks, Tony, and shift over to Summer. Mitch.
Thanks,
to-
Billy.
Awesome. So what Tony left you with here is this slide, which shows biomass estimates for each of the 4 main target species on each of the individual flats. So what I'm going to talk about is how we go from that data to a bay-wide or a whole bay biomass estimate for what we would use for management. And specifically what I'll be talking about is cockles, since what we've done is we've established a landing cap for intertidal cockle harvest in Tillamook Bay this year. So I'm specifically going to talk about how we got to that number using these data. So let me do that. So first off, you can see the flats that Tony's talked about and a couple others up here. So first, I want to point out that there are two flats that we haven't talked about yet, which are Torch Flat, TOR, and Duck Flat, DUK up there. And the reason that we haven't talked about that and won't talk about those much today is that in the 2010 to 2012 survey, there weren't any cockles that were observed on those flats. So they're up there, but we won't be talking a lot about those today.
Summer, did you say there were not any in 2010?
Yeah, no cockles observed on either of Torch or Duck Flat in 2010 in that survey.
Okay.
People. And
Yeah.
this year, and looked like they had.
Yeah, things, it is possible for sure that things have changed, but since we don't have updated data, it wouldn't factor into a biomass estimate for cockles specifically. So first off, we have multiple data sources that we'll be talking about here. Because as Tony shared, we have updated biomass estimates for 3 flats. Those 3 flats would be Garibaldi Flat, Middle Flat, and Bay Ocean North Flat, which we've talked about extensively. But when we're talking about a bay-wide biomass estimate like that, which is used for management and setting landing caps, we have to also consider the flats that were surveyed previously, which would include Bog Flat, Muck Flat, and Bay Ocean South Flat. Those are our names for them. You might know them as other things. So to get to that biomass estimate for the whole bay, we combine those 2 data sources. The biomass estimate from the 2022 Seeker survey, the data that Tony shared with you today, as well as the biomass estimate for the 3 flats that were surveyed in 2010 to 2012. So I have those numbers up there, but those combine to a mean biomass of 765,848 pounds. So I said mean there. So Tony already touched on that, but what we use a lot of the time for management is the most conservative estimate, which is the lower 95% confidence interval, which I have starred there. And that is 554,205 pounds. Any questions on this part of it?
Summer is the 80,000 pounds that commercials took in that number.
So this is
Sure.
biomass estimate from the 2010 and 2012 and the 2022 survey. That's what we saw when we were out there. It doesn't factor in, we don't add in or subtract out that
But
take.
you
for
know
these
that
purposes.
there, right, during your surveys, I mean, 80,000 pounds on top of that number is almost, another 100.
Yeah.
That's already been taken off as you guys are doing your surveys.
Yeah, I mean, since we survey, throughout part of that season, just some of it would be already taken, some of it would have been taken after we did surveys at some of these points. So what we're really looking for is that biomass estimate, at the end of that season. What will we have moving forward? And it might not be perfect, but it's really hard to factor in exactly when this area was sampled and, when plans were taken from that. So this is the best estimate that we're able to generate. Okay, so once we have this full number, I'm going to pass it over to Mitch to talk about how we go from a bay-wide biomass estimate to picking a number for a landing cap or intertidal cockles specifically.
The next one.
Yeah, you just hit next, should take it where you want to go.
Okay, and we'll let you say, okay, so again, this was highlighted, that's the lower 95% confidence interval of the intertidal biomass of the cockles. And the mean is higher than that, but this is what we're really sure of. There's at least that many of. And what we've been doing is to try to allow opportunity for harvest, but then try to also conservatively be conservative and make sure that those populations continue in the future. We've been focusing on this 15% intertidal, this 15% of the lower 95. So that this year, the best estimate we could come up with was old data and new data. It was 83,000 pounds, was that 15% level. Again, since we didn't get this number on January 1st, it was a little bit after that. We were comfortable with rounding that up a little bit and giving an allowance to increase that to the 90,000 pound quota that was set for 2023. We're going to probably do something very similar to that, although with the subtitle populations, we have gone with just 10 or even 5% of those biomass estimates. So, like we said, that is still below the 90,000 pounds is still below the 20% level that we could maybe have gone up to, but that's where we settled, 90,000 pounds.
Okay. There you go. I remember being told a long time ago that the biomass of the clams of the poplars, particularly on the tide flats, are kind of considered a natural predatory area, a loss of probably 90% of them on an average through, predation, weather, seagulls, all the different things that cause them to die, hot sun, people. So. And so that being said, having only doing a 20% or a 15% seems really small, considering most of those are considered, kind of a loss, and not necessarily that habitat spawning zone that they're coming from, that, you might as well just take the 90% of them that are gonna get lost potentially. I'm not saying do that.
Right.
They end up getting lost anyway, because the greater biomass of the clams, where they're spawning and stuff is out in the ocean and out in the jetties and out in the Kinslow Point and those areas out there. And not necessarily in, even where we're diving at, but in the.
Well, every constant's one when it gets
Especially
fishery.
not necessarily on the flats.
What are you telling me that they don't spawn when they're on the intertidal flat? Okay.
But the majority of the biomass is out on the flat.
Right.
And I'm just thinking that this seems like it's a low number, 15%. And then, we're seeing them after 180,000 pounds taken off of there, and then another 80 last year. And there's more clams out there than there ever were before. It doesn't seem like the commercial or the sport people altogether are necessarily affecting what happens on middle flat out there. It's because it's such an active conveyor belt.
Awesome. That's our goal.
That it will be sustainable
That's our goal.
at even the 20% level without any issue at all in the long run. And I think it could be a little higher.
Yeah.
Because of the amount of loss that is natural anyway.
It probably could be, but again, we are managing this on a bay-wide scale and a very long-term time scale. And so while at any given year or place, that harvest level could be a lot higher, we've gotten pressure from management above us to even keep it at a more conservative level than we're going for. So
How much?
that's the,
So like when you guys do the survey, like of say 4,000 acres of the bay. Your survey squares equal how much of that 4,000 acres, because you could say that there's a huge percentage of areas you guys don't actually survey where there's clams at and aren't kind of falling into any of these numbers. That's where you guys get the conservative.
that's one more
That's where.
one more, yeah.
So then
refuge
necessarily
that is not
yeah,
included.
where we're actually actively working at.
So based on the way that this has been managed in the past. Okay, and not necessarily what we will recommend. But would this 90,000 then be where you would put your landing cap for the next 10 years?
That's an excellent question. We are going to be wrestling with permanent rules when we get the subtitle numbers for the next set of landing caps for the dive quotas. And I don't see us using any different giant percentage in that case. But I guess anything's possible.
Well, if you were to do the 90,000 for the next so many years, and there is some sort of an environmental event that happens, then you guys just set yourself up for a failure.
Well, except for all those refuges that you just spoke of.
County's not surveying every year, so that we're actually having a survey come up with a number a year later, after the survey's actually done, you know.
I was assuming.
And that's our information that we're gathering as we die, you know, I mean, there's a reason you guys went from a little green log book that we used to have to different log books, because there's a data collection going on of the information, but yet it's still not being used in the data that we're working with as of yet.
Well, we've been collecting that spatial data and, no, we've not used that in a management structure yet, but that spatial information of the dive locations is really handy and, whether or not we, you know, get right down to the nitty gritty and divide the bay into 1,000 squares and figure out the harvest per square and use that as a management tool. While that could be an interesting, you know, method, it would be a whole lot of work to get there, and we'd still be looking at the time variability regardless.
Now you're talking about caps. Are you talking about setting a percent or setting an actual poundage?
An actual poundage based on a percentage of the current population
So
estimate.
actual pound, but based on percent. So
Yeah.
really your cap, every year that it would change based on your. percent.
No, that's not what we did in the past. In
Like,
2017.
If you had a disaster, I can see you would slow down, reduce harvest the following year, but if you had such surplus in of several years, you'd end up harvesting more, which would could then be a boon to the industry
Mhm.
because of their management or whatever they're doing is I don't want to say they're the ones increasing the population. What they're doing is not farming, it's increasing.
Mhm.
So it seems like you'd want to not set a poundage level as much as you'd want to set a percent of the lower median.
You guys, what we're talking about here is the good concept of adaptive management. If we had a stock estimate every year, we could certainly adapt.
I understand.
But, you know, we're in that spot where we're making that comparison from 10 years ago, because that's when we did our stock estimate. So in the interim, so we set the minimum caps based on percentage of the biomass. And then the tool that we have is if there are very unusual, real exceptional kinds of circumstances, then we have the ability to implement a temporary rule
Yeah,
to make an adjustment. That's a tool of management.
if we saw something really bad happening, we could adjust it
Or very
either
good.
way, or very good.
There was a big.
But again, to get a bay-wide estimate of a new population in the interim, I don't know how we would do that.
Well,
I have another question that Steve.
Yes.
Okay.
Anybody's paying attention to Steve.
Thank,
Do you want to go first and then I'll go again?
well, Christie, did you say go ahead?
Yeah, do you want to go first and then I'll go again?
Certainly. Just two observations or one comment and one observation and maybe a question. Isn't it fair to say that the 15% level of the lower 95 is designed, drawing off of that number is designed to give you a buffer in case of some of those dramatic events that could change that population? You're conservative enough that it should withstand at least normal fluctuations in the population. I think at least that's the way I view what you're doing with 15%. The second, and I've said this before, from a sport harvest perspective, at least for me to be successful out there harvesting clams, I have to have a fairly abundant population in order for that to work. So it's important that, you know, we don't want it, we're not trying to harvest to the maximum we can harvest, because that'll make it difficult for me as a sport harvester to get my harvest as well. So that's just 2 points. Maybe the question on that 15%, that's really acting as a buffer. Am I correct?
Yeah, definitely. So I was going to make that point that, you know, one of the reasons for going with the lower 95 and 15% of that is, you know, to create a buffer and to protect the population if there are bad recruitment years, or uncharacteristic population dynamics.
Right.
And then I think
Because
it's
you're
also
not-
a great point. Oh, go for it.
Well, you're not going to be able to do sample every year. You're not gonna be able to generate a stock assessment every year. So that conservative type approach is something that's used in a lot of different, fishery management, when you don't have a annual stock assessment.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Yep.
and then also on your second point, Steve, yeah, this landing cap doesn't take into account sport take. So that's on top of what, we
Right.
allow for commercial. And so it's important to know that, you know, there still is take beyond this
Mhm.
15% of,
Right.
Natural mortality.
as well as natural.
Right.
mortality.
Right.
Off of Garibaldi Flat, numbers of plants coming off of the main island is.
That's true. Most of the sport take comes up there.
The amount of traffic.
But this is where the log books could actually come in handy, is if you're looking at it and seeing a, you know, bringing it up or picking up more clams, you're seeing, an increase in clams, or, you know, anyway, using their log books, you could, if you saw a huge change or increase or, you know, whatever, and you could relate it to a better way of harvesting or something else, that could actually be used to change quotas in the middle of a 10-year cycle.
It is
So I
possible,
think
yeah.
to be consistent, so that should always be looked at and considered, and I'm not, you know. Yeah,
For this, instead this year, the market on clams is low. There was a lot of clams bought last year, there's a lot of clams left in the market from last year's clams. And so say we don't get anywhere near our quotas this year, and we leave half of the quotas in the bay for diving. We probably won't for raking, but that's still possible because the market, nobody wants to buy clams. say.
Really, this demand is not there
Oh,
right
no,
now.
no,
huh?
the crab season destroyed it this year. Starting out 40 some days late, you know, that's a huge blow, and having $2.50 a pound of crab when it was $7 last year, nobody's trading bait for crab right now. And they're not gonna pay $2.75 for clams when they're getting $1.50 for crab, or, you know, $2 for crab. So what's gonna happen this year is they're probably not gonna see a quotas plan, maybe cockles, but you're not gonna probably see the butter clam quotas planted this year. Because there's just not a marked demand. So next year, are you gonna add that to the percentage that we didn't take this year?
No,
Well, that would be, but that would still.
I mean, when we start adding in market demand to our
You see my point, though, there won't
See,
be the quantity of clams, so there'll be that much more biomass next year, more than there would have been. Not a survey being done to show that, to change our quotas, but you guys could obviously do the, you know, math that there's this much left, you could add a little bit to these guys' thing next year, because this year, and if the market's gonna be bad next year again, are we gonna take them, even if you added it to us? No. So it's gonna police itself with the crab market. If the crabbers can only use so many of these clams, that we're not gonna end up blowing it up and taking everything out of the whole bay.
Yeah.
You know, there's gonna be fluctuations on all sides, not just the weather.
I
and
know,
clouds,
so
but on our
many,
industry
so
as
many
well.
drivers.
So there'll be, that's, you know, a big factor on how much that 15%, you know, will matter in a year later or something like that. You know, it's not taken, what we're allowed. That should be something that could be added on. To some degree, maybe not the whole percentage we don't take, but a fraction of that or something like that could be added to the quota next year. If we have a bad year this year, we may need a good year next year financially to keep active and keep the industry running. So it's just, I'm just saying, you know, there will be a year like this year where there is no big market. There has been, you know, because there's still potentially enough clams and some people smoother to supply the crabbers this year. So, you know,
I think that stresses the fact that we need to be looking strongly at Cuba for things.
oh, I agree with that. I agree with that too, but, you know, there's the other factors like, you know, the razor clam and stuff being taken, so many of that affected the market this year, how many are still sitting on those and all those other things, so there's a lot of, they consider a lot of factors involved with it. But there is that potential where like some years we don't touch some of the population, even if we're asking for that.
If you have one more question, and then I'm watching the clock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just another question about the calculation here, when you're looking at, fog and sorry, well, and a couple of the other, sites that you're using the joint. And
Yeah,
is the idea then, because you're only doing this every 10 years, and then you have to, and you'll do the resource limited, so the next time that you would survey, you would go to those sites and update that data?
well, yeah, that's gonna happen this year.
Exactly.
We're just-
So by the end of this year, we should have all of the intertidal
Gotcha.
flat stock estimates.
Yeah.
And for that,
These numbers, because we're seeing that if the cockles are going up for the sites that you did do, even though it's a little bit, these might go up because
Yeah,
that's
they
10-year data.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's also.
I mean, definitely on Bob, we're seeing a lot more couples than we ever saw. In the
And so
previous survey.
it's possible if you were to actually get some data from Torch or Duck, that instead of making your estimates based on zeros being there, that you might have estimates.
Yeah, those estimates of zero is totally wrong. So
Correct, because
they're-
that's based on.
They're some of the biggest plants that are in the Bay Area.
So that,
I mean,
that
there's
information,
toggles there.
Okay.
You know.
all right.
All right, so let me jump in. This is perfect time to segue into the next one. I was pointing at Christie because she asked that question right at the beginning of the discussion. This is an unusual year because we've got the data sets for those 3 sites and we have to use the old data sets.
Yeah.
Now Tony's going to describe the work for get the new data sets for those missing ones.
Okay,
And then when we have that, we'll reassess the biomass estimates and set a new one. So with that, I'll pass over back to Tony. For the rest
that
of the.
smells good.
Okay, let's talk about some of those other areas that are being surveyed. So again, this is kind of like the overall plan for the Tillamook survey. And so in 2023, the primary regions are Fog Flat, Muck Flat, and Bay Ocean South. Pretty large areas to cover. For Fog Flat, we've already completed the habitat grid samples for that tide flat. And the team now is starting on essentially the dam sites that will then have habitat and shellfish data. They've done some work on both the habitat and habitat shellfish samples on Muck Flat, and then Bay Ocean South will likely be done later in the summer because a lot of the effort and time over the next couple of months is going to be devoted to the subtitle survey that'll be starting up in just a couple of weeks. And so for the subtitle assessment survey, this is going to be conducted as it's conducted as a joint operation between ODFW with 2 of our vessels involved, as well as commercial science divers. The company we've been using is Marine Taxonomic Services, based out of Albany and San Diego. Survey will begin April 30th and completed by June 30th. With 4 4-day surveys around good tides for the dive operations. And then the sampling areas in talking about the spatial data, essentially what I have been doing these areas here were actually what was sampled during the 2012 subtitle survey, but these areas are currently being modified because although probably 80% of the data from the dive logbooks since 2010 fall within these areas. There are also some other areas where diving has been done, and then we've looked at essentially the clams that were also landed in some of those locations to get an idea of where populations may have shifted in the subtitle. So I'm in the process of kind of adjusting some of these areas to incorporate those areas in the current dive survey. And so that's been a fairly rich data source for me to use to kind of make those types of shifts with that. But they'll still be overlapped with the 2012 survey to do the comparisons. It also overlaps historical ODFW surveys. So there were a number of dive surveys that were done in the 70s, 80s, and 90s by ODFW, as well as some newer areas.
Tony, what are the colors represent other than just areas?
They just represent areas, so they're just a way to distinguish essentially how we've divided up portions of the bay, whether it's, so we would call this Hobsonville Channel versus Main Channel versus Bay Ocean Channel. It's just a way to kind of divide up the effort to ensure that, you know, with the total number of dive days we have and the number of sampling points that we're distributing them across all the different areas that we plan to survey. And then just to give you an idea of how this works is essentially we have essentially a modified dredge system, which is a little bit larger than the one we use for the intertidal work. That's then been modified to be used by divers in there. And then this is just an example of a diver actually actively sampling an area. And so this ring defines a ½ meter squared, and they sample down to meter depth in order to get all of the clams within that location for that survey. And then some of the major changes, some of which I've discussed, is we have some areas are being modified based on the last 10 years of dive log data, particularly for the dive logs since 2016. We have some additional areas around Kinchelo Point and a subtidal region around Garibaldi Flat that we had not surveyed before, but had been previously surveyed in the 70s and shown that there were clam populations. And that one of the big changes that we've done with our subtidal surveys since we first did the ones done back in 2012 is the divers are also taking GoPro video of every site location and sampling area. So we have a little bit more visual information on the habitat there, and that they are science divers. So they're also collecting habitat data that's comparable to what we collected in intertidal. So we get a little bit more kind of habitat associations for the clams. And this is important for us in the long term, because if you think about any type of proposals for things like dredging or other alterations to the subtidal area, you know, we want to make sure that we're preserving the habitats that are important to the clam populations in the subtidal area. And so that's kind of a big change and a little added work that we've been able to incorporate into the surveys. I think that's our plan. We're being implemented.
What would it take you to be able to dive in, you know, random spots in some of these other channels to i.e. show that there are clams there or there aren't clams there? Because down the road, you know, somebody, I can pull my ROV video out and say, yeah, I see there are these clams in these channels, and these numbers aren't, you know, they're low because these other channels weren't, you know, surveyed ever, you know, and so surprisingly, there's clams in pockets in some of those areas, and in some areas there's not. So, you know, random sampling would be, I think, important of all of those channels and other spots that are out of those zones, even in areas we don't dive in.
Yeah.
You know,
and I agree 100%. However, we do have, like, particularly for this survey, you know, we have even less days. We have 2 less days than we had previously when we did it in 2012. And unfortunately, you know, we had proposed kind of long-term funding to ensure that we had, you know, a couple of weeks of dive surveys every biennium. That just hasn't moved forward yet. I mean, it's definitely something that
we'd love to
We'd love to have.
explore, but every time we go up some side channel and spend a day or a half a day, that means right now we'd have to give up a day or a half a day in the really high focused area.
who's keeping you from, I mean, other than funds, and you guys, you're trying to figure out how much the FAR will go, you know, who is it to hit up? If these other spots need to be looked at,
The legislature
this legislature.
to create more positions.
So that's something we should be recommending.
I think
More days,
Ready.
not necessarily more positions, but just more days for you and people that are already doing it to do more days.
Yeah, and so that's what, like, when we had gotten, you know, the funding that's now going away after this biennium, you know, part of packaging in that is that built into the funding, not just because when we're talking about funding positions, those positions also come with like operational funds for field work. And so within that is where we also had additional funds put into in order to support additional dive day work. And so when we're talking about that additional funds, it would include that extra pot of funds that we could then dedicate to having X number of days every year to add to kind of what the secret work is.
You folks have advice for us, because we're gonna put, the science team up there around Kinchlow Point. They have, Tony, is that correct? They have not been in there before, right?
I've never been in there before.
And we're concerned about currents in there that's outside the main flood and ebb current.
This guy's a slack talking.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's pretty much where we're at.
yeah.
That's why we picked those days. that we picked.
It's, yeah.
I would say, on the inside of Kinslow Point, don't dive on the incomings, and on the outside of it, don't dive on the outgoings. And that's about the best, safety advice I can give you in those areas. You just, it's too
But
much.
that triangle around Kinchlow Point, that looks like an okay spot to target.
Inside the,
Yeah.
inside there, where we've been working, yeah,
Good small ties, like the 3-foot exchanges.
yeah.
Yeah, that's where we're targeting.
Yeah.
It's kind of a 3 to 4 foot exchanges.
Side that on an incoming, that area is all right, but on the other side where it's swirling, where you're getting the little cyclones, you don't want to be anywhere near that.
Yeah, and is that on that inner Kinchlow, is that kind of like a gravelly, cobbly beach?
You don't gravel the great waves, but the gravel when you're down the dive, it's pretty cool, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, it's super gravel there.
There's sand in that triangle, you've got a variety of everything from, gravel strips to sand, a big area of sand, so. Along the jetty and, I wouldn't be up in the shallows next to the beach there, nothing to see there probably. There's clams there, but they're, I don't know how stable they are there, because that's always changing. There are some clams over there. So.
Probably won't be that shallow.
But yeah, the area on the main island there in front of Seal Island, what I call Seal
Yeah.
Island, that whole cove in there is.
Yeah, so that's actually gonna be added. That's one of the areas I'm adding, because that clearly came out in the dive log data.
And the other channel midway up the bay, past Seal Island where it splits into two channels on a tour and I think it is between those two. And then over by Hobsonville up the other channel should be looked at. And clear up past your blue on the Hobsonville up there, that little triangle island, there's cockles and clams clear up in there.
Mm.
So that we're both breaking and diving. So.
All right, so, we're gonna, thank you for all of that, everybody, thank you. I'm just trying to keep on the schedule and give the subcommittee time to talk about what you guys got together on transferability of planning limits. So I can sort and turn it over to Claire. I'm so sorry for my voice.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're dealing with that.
So, taking a look at, the sheet you guys have there, the area in the bottom is the areas that we're looking at increasing or doing. If you look at the administrative rules that are actually present for planned harvest, they're very limited. There's not much there, and they deal with replacement vessels. If you lose a vessel, which we had happen this year, and then a replacement vessel and things like that, that's what A deals with. I put these in because these are the rules that are there now. It deals with replacement vessels only. Then B deals with debt only. Okay, and C deals with transfer on medical condition. That's it. Okay, so there's nothing in there with transferability on normal, or just trying to move a permit from one area to another. It just doesn't exist. And right now, if it does exist, it generally, it can go to it normally, I think, goes to the lottery. And then the lottery, it goes up to the lottery, and then people who have been vested in in harvest income, like they put a lot of money into it or develop something, could be completely, I mean, it's a lottery. It's a chance like thing. So that was the biggest concerns of the group as we were meeting. Anybody add in stuff you want to add in as we go? But that was a huge concern. And so looking at, we got list of things from, I think, Mitch sent these over from like the Dungeness crab and the sea urchin and sea cucumber and other permit type things that exist out there. We saw that generally there was a transferability that was allowed, a fully transferable thing where like permit could be transferred to, with some guidelines, to another individual who was interested in doing it. One of the gentlemen that was at our meeting is an old diver who has a permit he wants to get rid of and cannot get rid of it right now. And I think one of you were running on this. I can't believe it.
Oh, Sam.
I'll leave it. But the point is that here he's got a permit, he wants to get rid of it, but if it goes back to the general lottery, most likely it'll end up with somebody not from Tillamook Bay getting it. And I'd like to see it end up supporting the people who've actually invested and are here in Tillamook Bay already. And so looking at that as a group, that's where these suggestions came from.
Yeah.
So the fully transferable permit to another vessel purchaser, sold even as an individual. So that's actually three different things we're talking about there, kind of all up in one sentence, but I assume somebody has some words, that has to figure out what actually is legal and how to put those together. Those are three different issues: the vessel, the purchaser of a vessel, or, sold or to an individual. Those are three different transfers, but they could all be treated the same, but we've listed them together, in the thing. And then, we also discussed what that value would be, because that turned out to be an issue, with how can it be transferred, what is the value, and it is a rights-based.
Well, let me interject there. ODFW does not get involved in that.
That's just.
That's commercial, it's less market value stuff.
Yeah, it's just right, just like crap permits worth what another crap permit's gonna be sold by.
So,
Yeah.
okay, I put this out to you guys.
Yeah, like we get like $127 when a permit.
Yeah, I saw it. So I didn't know if that was involved, or if they couldn't.
So there's really, I mean, other than,
Okay, so,
yeah, I was just gonna say, when it comes to the transfer of the other permits, there's, the writing's already there for all the other permits. The diving permit just needs to be made similar, the same. Like wording doesn't need to be anything, there doesn't need to be a separate form for a dive permit when it's already on the transfer packet. It's kind of already all there, except for this, the diving, the diver part and a couple of the other landings. Be the only thing that needs to be changed though, than the wording, what's in the transfer packet already.
so, right, so we don't need, it's already recognized.
Yeah, A, B, and C.
So it doesn't matter that we emphasize that.
Yeah, and the limitations, A, B, and C already exist. Yeah, but those are all there. B, I was curious about what the discussion was around developing limitation number D, the reduction, attrition of permits from 10 to 8.
Yeah, so down there,
Well, for one, the bay can't handle, I don't think, companies as big as mine, Levi's, if all 8 or all 10 permits were all active in Tillamook Bay, I don't think it would make sense for the bay or for the companies in the end. But I mean, post wise, there's not enough other bays that we can dive in to look for clams. I mean, there's a lot
Lots of them.
there's a lot of closed bays though, to dive permits. Because it's the harvesting of clams in bays, there are other.
There's a couple.
There's some,
Yeah, but not the big ones.
no, but there's some clams in those bays.
Well, if people wanted to dive in other bays, they can.
Yeah.
so letter.
But I didn't understand why the permits would be reduced if the quotas were not met.
Yeah, so here's this is where that issue is. So first of all, the idea was year-round work. Another one was family wages. So right now it's that it's kind of contained within those seasons and things like that. And the other issue was, so those were discussed. So those two things came into the decision. And then the part that the claim quota in the bay, if you're looking at it, is like not increasing a whole lot. And yet there are several permits that are in the bay right now that are not being used very much at all. They're almost not in use. And one of them, anyway, that was discussed several people at that meeting that within the next few years, we can see an attrition easily by 2 people who are not meeting that quotas. So those 2,000 already on working, 5 to 10, they're not working.
And that's part of the reason we haven't held a lottery. Because the quotas are being met, the industry seems balanced.
Yeah, but and it's being balanced, but without those being met, we don't want to see those actually go into the quotas, go into that lottery and get put out, because that creates more competition for jobs that already are fairly badly supported of industries for a long term. That's where that whole thing came from. And so, and looking at actually the data we saw today, I think, and seeing that the numbers are similar to what they already are this year, or maybe the next few years, without the dive data and the other data that's in there, which is quite a bit of data still. That would indicate that probably we don't want to be increasing the dive above what we have, that's what we have. And so just letting as those that are not harvesting go out, not increasing, not putting those lotteries back.
Okay.
And that was the idea behind that, was to drop down to where we actually have an easily more manageable system.
Like what happened with the urchin fishery and many others. They let it come down to a static level. And that would be great to put, as much supporting information in the recommendations as you can come up with. And if you need any supportive data that I can provide, let me know.
Okay, so so the reason why you're asking this question is to make sure that when we make our recommendations, we're giving enough background so that whoever is voting on accepting our recommendations understands why this is important.
Yes. Rationale, yeah.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So my read of D initially was a reduction in coastwise or the Tillamook Bay dive plan permits from 10 to 8 by attrition if the quota isn't met by the fishery. But that's not what you mean. You mean if a quote.
By the individual.
Okay.
Already.
Yeah.
They accepted in letter A, by my. And that would of course be not because they have a boat broke down or all the other possible bad reasons they could ask, it would be because they just didn't bother.
Yeah.
And then the permit goes back into the lottery and some, giant company buys it and sends in, the A team. And literally, it's a capitalistic society, but at the same time, you don't want to displace what's already going on in a community. With having, all the investment that we have already in place with these permits that can just evaporate in the air overnight. So. So, we have another one here.
Yeah, Steve Williams has a question.
So I maybe because I didn't hear what you said, but when you say attrition if quotas are not met, you meant the annual renewal requirements that are associated with those permits. Is that right?
Oh, renewal requirements are not met. Thank you.
Yeah, it might be nice to clarify that. Just
Okay. But let me finish my question. If that's in fact the case, 10 to 8, what if you get a third permit that is not does not meet its annual renewal requirements, because you have to check that every year. That one goes in the lottery, is that right? The 7th permit, or there'd be the 8th permit would go into the lottery if it was there. Is that how that would work?
That would make sense to me.
I mean, this very thing happened between 2006 and 2016, when it was developmental fishery. They added permits to the limited entry and then they took them away, and then they made some South Coast. So one other way to word this would be to, let the number of permits fall to 8.
8, yes.
Be attrition, and then start over with 8 being the maximum.
But only.
Correct.
Well, that's
That goes by.
That's coastwide.
I don't own any.
Okay,
But I'm running too.
So if you run 2, and this is just stuff like southeast sane permits, you take away permits, you're never gonna get them back.
No, and I get that.
And if you own to get to those 10, or you use those 10, I would watch
But they wouldn't disappear unless you didn't meet the renewal requirements, right? So if it's an active permit, it's always gonna be
Yeah.
an active permit.
It'd be just the people that slacked off that didn't
Yeah,
pass or didn't, you know. Didn't have the mark.
Now, I mean, I think the reality is gonna be, once you put these in place, those two that are not being used, I think you're gonna push people to go out and get their 2,500 pounds. There's some value there. Why would anyone let that lapse? Somebody's gonna go out, if they already have the permit, they're gonna fill it, and then you won't have any attrition. If you, at least we've seen that in other places, the permit has value, particularly with this transferability that you're putting in place. I would be surprised if anybody would let those lapse.
It happens.
it has happened.
It happens to families.
When they weren't fully transferable. They're not fully transferable, and many have lapsed, and many have been
Yeah.
bought in the lottery and then lapsed.
Right.
Because those people
And does the
weren't.
state want to just keep having the lottery go through a lottery to somebody that just keeps not doing anything? I mean, how much of a waste of.
As I was reading, you couldn't sell your permit unless you were actually actively participating.
Well, that's how it works with some other permits, like.
Some of the permits, but if you don't meet your data, somebody else, you can't sell it.
You can sell it. So the vote. So there's a bunch of different rules. for all the different issues for that.
Yeah, and that's why I included some, but not every single limited entry permit that I represent here.
So is there a way to, so to drop from 10 to 8, which is actually fairly beneficial, I think, for the industry and for the people who invested into it. And that this is not unusual, by the way, to favor people with timber grazing stuff or with oyster leases or all kinds of stuff. So I don't think that's an issue. I don't think I hear that as an issue here. But I know it's an issue on the big public domain part. It's not an issue as far as people who invested things into it, losing all their doing a lot of loss. How do you go from 10 to 8?
Well, the public domain, they've got the option to not buy them. You know, as opposed to wait, or the chance that we lose them to the lottery, that we have a chance to possibly pull them into the public domain. On get the lose them, but if they're for sale and it's still public, if somebody really wants one, they're gonna come and say, I want you to permit.
Yeah, but to answer Claire's question, I don't think we can go from 10 to 8. I think we would have to wait for 2 permits to go latent and then not be filled. We can't take away permits. No, that's not gonna happen.
So the way it's written here is the best way it's possible.
No, you don't want.
Yeah, only through attrition, yeah.
So I want to run on to a couple of things. So one was, and I don't know who deals with this, and we didn't actually figure it out in our meeting, but we're talking about, it's got a thing here with that 2 divers allowed per permit. And the issue wasn't so much the 2 divers per permit, it was more the fact that only one person on a boat with 2 divers. Who controls that? Because if they were, I heard several several people talking that at times, you might need 8 persons per diver on a boat. To manage the boat, so they have 3 people on a boat with 1 on the boat and 2 divers. Who manages that?
There's no scientific reason to only have 1 outside person on a boat. I mean, it's in the rule that you can only have 2 divers harvesting. If I want to take 4 people out on the boat on the top side while I sit there in the wheelhouse and tell them what to do, that's just $127 to ODF&W 5 more times for the commercial license. It's not there's no change in the way we're harvesting the clams with the people on the deck. You know, that it actually just gives us more eyes and ears when we go to the coastal safety issue, for instance. Keeping track of somebody running over somebody on accident, you know, and I'm busy by myself trying to tend to 2 divers, all the things you got to do, have my head down trying to sort clams. I don't have as much time as I'd like to monitor traffic and all the other things. And there's reasons that the OSHA have standards for commercial divers that don't reflect whatsoever in our industry's standards that the state set up for us.
So this has nothing to do with transferability. It's something that we need to address. Or maybe.
I think we need to address it because it's just one of the bigger concerns with the privacy. On safety, on just my
recommendation
just my business if I want
with
to.
new rule wording and a recommendation.
But it wouldn't be in the This for, it wouldn't be in the transferability beware.
No, it's in the rules around the dive bay clam permits.
It's in the, under the ordinance.
So anyway, that was a concern to actually have a lot of discussion.
Yeah. It goes way back in history, again, back to the early 2000s, and a lot of the thought was put around a permit. A lot of the permits originally were set to individuals. So like you had a permit, you had a permit, you had a permit. And then you could all go out on one boat if you wanted to, or you could go out on any boat if you wanted to. And so there was a lot of flexibility in the fishery back then. But it's changed through time. Virtually all of them are now assigned to a vessel. That way they can get the maximum number of divers on that vessel. But if we allowed an unlimited number of divers on a vessel with a permit, then that permit would have much more harvest capacity than some other
We're
permit.
not talking about that. We're just talking about the fact that it was limited to one person on the boat with 2 divers.
Mhm.
And so letting there be 2 people on a boat doesn't increase,
The only way to increase harvest is if you rotated your divers, which we can do anyway. But what we gotta do is either run out somebody with a skiff to the boat and transfer people off. You know, so there's still like, it doesn't stop any of the loopholes that can still allow you
it does change.
to rotate divers. It doesn't really change that aspect of it. You can still rotate, but just make 2 trips, you know, but it is more about safety factor of having. If I have a diver that fails and we have a strong current and he's back hanging on the flag back there.
You get hit.
And I'm already tired, I've already had to try to pull in, you know, Polly weighing 400 pounds with 150 pounds of clams against the 3-knot current, and I literally herniated my neck, you know, trying to pull them in. If I'd have had another diver there, we should let go of the clams.
So it's an issue, not with transferability, but with safety on the boats, and it doesn't increase, because we're not talking about putting more divers on the boat, we're talking about.
Just able bodies up top.
Able bodies up top,
To make it safer.
The divers, they can't even keep up with it during the vapor season. Like I'm up there just sweating eyeballs trying to keep up with them, but they're down there grabbing clam, almost as fast. And I'm up there trying to bag them. You know, it's just not possible. And at the end of the day, I've got 10 bags on the deck still that haven't been even dumped on the table. It's just too much,
They're
too
last,
fast.
yeah.
Yeah, so any number of recommendations can be made around that topic. Safety.
There's a whole bunch of reasons behind that.
Anyway, and then, the last one, letter C, only one permit for individuals who don't stack the permits, was one of the concerns of the group in the beginning, when we actually met and discussed and brainstormed stuff, it was the idea of stacking permits, somebody owning all the permits and monopolizing the industry versus, having permits set around, so I don't know if any divers want to talk about that or not, but it's,
I would say that in some ways I would keep people from stacking them, me putting 5 permits on myself, but at the same time, if I want to take over the industry, I'll just buy the other guy's permits. You know.
You could manage
If I can manage.
multiple permits right now,
Yeah,
but only a person can only have one.
one on
permit.
their thing.
Right,
That's
and
the
the
same
vessel
thing.
can only have one.
That's
That's
the
in the
same,
right.
that should be the same, but I guess it wouldn't really matter in the end whether somebody wants to take over the industry. We can't really base it on that necessarily. Be more to it'd just be following the guidelines of the other permits that are going,
Get one
If I
permit per
wanted
boat.
2 permits, I just go 2 permits.
I mean, the crabbers have asked for permit stacking. Some permit holders have asked for permit stacking. Once pot limits went in, they wanted to put another permit on their boat and get that pot limit on that boat so they could.
But that would be the
Build that
equivalent
way.
of us to one, we were stacking them, wanting to put 2 more divers on my boat, and that's just not logistically gonna work. Like, you know, you can put 6 divers on the boat if that's 3 permit.
Well, yeah, every fishery is different, and I believe that in the past, our commission has looked at maintaining a good, diverse industry with opportunity for many, many different participants, and they would be hesitant, I believe, to go down any route that would make a loophole for someone to sort of all the permits.
On the one.
Hey, Mitch, can I ask a question?
Certainly,
Ryan from OSP. I just had a question whether or not it was discussed on the permits that are issued to individuals about maybe moving those to a vessel so that there is some standardization, across some of the other fisheries where the permits issued to the vessel. I know with the individual permits, I don't believe there's any requirement for that individual to be on board the vessel. And so it can kind of move around. And be tough to track for enforcement. So I just didn't know if there's any discussion in regards to that.
I can try to address that. But again, back in the day, there were many permits that were designated as individual permits. Right now in rule, you can switch your permit from a vessel permit to an individual permit. But you couldn't go out on a vessel that didn't have a permit with no individual that had a permit on it. If that makes sense. So if you were to go out there and pull up to a dive boat in whatever safe manner was necessary, you would say, hey, here's a dive operation. Where's the permit here? And you'd very quickly realize if it's Jim, he's down on the bottom, it's his permit, and you would know who that was. Or it's this vessel, and you would know who that was. Does that make sense, Ryan?
Sure, but some of those permits are issued to individuals who aren't on the vessel, and so those permits, they're leased out or whatever to folks to use that permit with that individual who's issued the permit isn't actually on the boat.
Well, that does not sound legal.
That is illegal, yes. Like,
Yeah.
so for example, like I used to have my permit as an individual,
Yeah.
I could dive off of any vessel I wanted to.
Yes.
So now if I had that, if I gave someone that permit to use, that would be illegal, so like say.
Yeah, you can't do that.
Now, if I have my permit attached to a vessel, then anybody can dive off of that vessel without me being present.
Yes.
And that's what's going on now. I don't know that there's even an individual that has a permit on.
I've been looking at the permit list and they're all vessel. I think they got rid of that column even. In the,
I think you could still.
you could call Julie and figure it out.
If
Yeah.
I wanted, if Mike wanted to put my guy whose permit is on my boat.
Yeah.
Is wanted to put it back on himself and go dive himself, he could do that,
To do that.
but that's not what can happen.
No. I don't believe so.
But, so Ryan's never gonna find, the boat out there without him on it when the permit's on his person, but the permit's on the person's or on the boat. So it's, they're all covered. So there is kind of a standardization going on already. But
Yeah.
the fact that everybody has them on a boat.
Yeah. Let's loop back around, Ryan, and we can talk about and see if there's any permits right now that are issued to individuals. And
Sounds
talk
good.
about that. Yeah. Good question.
This has been really a good meeting, lots of good information, lots of good discussion. We're running out of time. And so it's time for us to look to what we're gonna do next. So we've got really just two more official meetings, two more quarterly meetings, which will be in July, maybe 13. And then in October, and that's when our final report is. And we had talked about doing subcommittee meetings or interim meetings with our group. We had suggested that maybe in May, a subcommittee group would get together to talk about the, one of our topics that was the potential change to limited entry permit for commercial airtail rape fisheries. And we had talked about, I don't know if we had anything scheduled in June, but for July, not only are we gonna hear a little bit more about the CPOR data, but we had also hoped that we would be talking about the special management area. That's where what I had written down. And then, of course, if anybody is going to be really interested in any of the final topics that we had in here, we're going to have to schedule some additional subcommittee meetings, because the final, really after July, we're gonna have to start piecing together the final report. And so not sure if anybody would like to take the lead on May's meeting. on that particular topic. It's not something that I have any expertise in. Anything about commercial and refrigeration. And so if, anybody would like to do that, anybody would like to lead that discussion, or we can send out a little poll and see who wants to get together for that, or Blair, you think that your group needs to meet again? We,
I don't know, what's my group thing? Meet and hash something around, and maybe, we could do that.
Yeah. For sure.
Make sure, yeah, sure the president get with us.
I'll be there.
guys will maybe try to get today.
Yeah.
Yeah, put it up over, you know.
So if you guys somehow, in just a few minutes when we close, or you guys can, we can get a date figured out, we can do it, that would be really helpful for us. Because this time we set a date and couldn't quite do it, and we had to switch to another one, and then it ended up being talking to individuals and
Yeah.
kind of putting things together and then having a, I don't know what else. People not even in this committee,
Yeah.
you know, as well as, people, so anyways, so.
And certainly, I think, you know, if you guys just let us know when you're all meeting, then everybody else,
So is anybody not in the diving, so anybody else interested? No, Steve isn't up there. He's probably up there somewhere.
I think he's there. I think he just didn't speak last, so that's why he's not showing. Let me clarify though. Yep, looks like he's there.
and then also if there is anything, I guess, based on what you guys want in May, we can look at, we need to meet in June to talk about anything else, before we get the final, results in July. So after July, then there's gonna be pretty much a big crunch to get stuff finished.
So the final result be revealed in July.
We're hoping,
For
right?
sure.
Or mostly,
For sure.
mostly.
No pressure.
No.
How much?
We'll have a hint, because literally the dive survey would have been finished 2 days before the end of June.
Yeah,
But so we'll have just kind of like a quick report out
yeah.
of that and probably a quick run of those numbers. Depending on when we in July,
We're thinking, we were talking about it had to be a little later part of
that
it.
is better.
That certainly makes it.
Yeah, that should be feasible.
I guess that one of the main things is that we certainly need to have whatever information we can have to try to look at special management.
Yeah, so that's what, so if we look at as a focus for TBCAC 13 special management areas, my understanding, we're interested in exploring identification of special management area in the intertidal zone for recreational clammers. And so what our team could do is put together the information that we have about where we know, popular areas for recreational clamming. We could also, from the hotspot map, when a while ago, we've got that. And we could take a look at that and present that to you. We could also, what could we do? We could also ask the CEQA team in the out to do some quick counts in the areas that are out in the way, in the areas that are out in the bay. And Claire, we could ask you to provide us with info. You guys have counts, the language in there of all the flats, restricted just to the flats, so, right? We could assemble some data sets, it wouldn't be perfect, but some background information just to address where are the popular sites for the recreation plan. I think we know about that already.
I have one quick comment going back to subcommittees, since not every committee member is here today. If you could just send out the date that you'll be meeting to the larger group, just to make sure specifically Barbara's not on today. If she wants to join in, that she could. That's it.
Anything from you guys on the ranking? Like, you guys have any ideas where that should be leaded or headed?
An opinion on whether or not that should go limited entry? Sure. I don't have an opinion.
At this point.
My only thought that changing a fishery to from open access to limited entry is a extended process.
Been done with other fish.
Oh, yeah,
So there are examples.
yes.
Is that, is there any way in the next couple weeks, trying to find out from maybe either 2010 to 2000 now about how many more commercial rakers are around? It's just turned out. It seems like there's a heck of a lot more now than there used to be.
So if I look at. I can look at just off the top of my head, I know because I just looked at this. If I look at total commercial shellfish harvest permits, predominantly they're provision, right? So that's where the number one is. And then it goes down to bay clams, bay shrimp. The bay clam number has not changed significantly through time, but it might be changing significantly in different areas. So it might be more in Tillman and less in bay. Yeah. So I can give you an idea of the total number, but I don't know. The only way I'd be able to really tell us the landings by each year, like number of individuals.
There's activity, which is a.
Yeah, so, I mean, we get 80% of the people that, 60% of the people that get the shellfish, commercial shellfish harvest permit make landings. There's 40% that do not. And that's across the board in all fisheries. So, you know, it's a tremendous amount of people that just, for whatever reason, like to spend money and never use it.
Yeah.
I guess that's maybe society in general, but.
Lower the people that actually vote.
That's a low percentage. So, I mean, but you could look at the total number of permits and then the total number of people that are harvesting in an individual bay.
Okay.
So I can give you some,
And then the number of people in a bay that landed more than 500 pounds.
Yeah.
Something
At one time?
No, for the year,
Oh, okay.
because there's a significant portion that get the permit, check the bay plan box, make some landings, but
Maybe only
aren't
3 or 4
really
minutes.
clam rakers.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that, it's like, yeah, my buddy told me to go out, and they go out, they dig 50 pounds, and I go like, this is the worst job I've ever.
So who do you want to send that information to? Because that's information we would need.
Yeah.
This, you can give you my email.
Yeah, whatever.
You can send it to Summer and.
I'll send it to Summer. She's looking at me saying.
Send it to Summer.
And I can,
I
Just fits.
have a bunch of that already.
You probably do.
yeah, we really do.
Let me look.
But I mean, it's easy enough, but it's mainly just queries and answers.
Yeah.
So the data is coming.
Already sitting.
I know, I know, that's what I'm talking about.
But we can get it after next week.
Yeah, I mean,
Next week or after next week.
I have a couple things going on. I can probably get to it maybe later this week. Or the next week, so they pour it.
This week's only tomorrow.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Or his don't forget Friday. I'm really,
You're in a long time zone.
yeah.
Yeah, if you got it to me within a couple weeks and then I got it out to you all immediately, would that work?
I've got a memo, I gotta get on something else, but I could probably work it in between previously.
Okay,
Get the word work.
and I'll send it out as soon as I get it.
I got notes for ODFW's marching orders here, so we'll take care of that. We'll also put together a background just on our knowledge about where recreation planning occurs in the day. That would be helpful when we talk about developing the recommendations for special mention area, which you.
Hey, thank you. Wraps it up.
About there.
I think so, this one, but you guys can get your dates and thank you, everybody. This is
All right.
really good.
Thanks very
And
much.
I wanted to let you know, this is not planning this time. We just published our news report, so anybody wants to take over copies of our annual report.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I don't know how many you brought.
I brought money.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Share all the. Great input.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the accommodation. Thank you.
Of course.
Good talking to you, Steve.
It's pretty good.
Bye-bye.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.